very pleased to have Raghavi Viswanath, and you've put it over your name, and Jessica Wiseman speaking. I gather they're going to adopt a very unusual technique of speaking at the same time, so we may have trouble hearing them, but we'll see how that works. Okay, so guys, the floor is yours. You should turn your microphone.
Yes, done. Can you hear me? And can people online hear us? Great, okay. Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Those in the physical room, also those in the virtual room. Thank you so much for joining us today for this talk that's titled Unpacking Expert Authority, the Case of the Blue Helmets for Culture. My name is Raghavi Viswanath. I'm a second-year law researcher at the EUI.
And my name is Jessica Wiseman. I'm also a second-year researcher in the law department.
Our presentation today hopes to draw from a work in progress. I think that's an important caveat, which is meant to be published as part of an edited Routledge collection. We must add that we had the chance to present a rather rudimentary version of this paper at Sapienza University in December. And we've actually been aggressively perhaps reworking the paper in light of some very exciting new developments, which we thought we'd share today. We'd appreciate feedback, especially on some of these connections that we've made between the legal, political implications, and also on the style. David, I see that.
So I should ask this, do you prefer to request questions during the talk, or should we save them for the end?
Let's perhaps save them for the end, because there is lots of sections are tied to sections that follow, which hopefully will answer some of the questions that come up immediately.
So
wait to the end.
Wait for the end for questions. Now I think I'll hand over to Jess to kick us off.
Okay, great. So in 2016, UNESCO signed a memorandum of understanding with the Italian government. And in this MOU, it established the Italian Unite for Heritage Task Force. It was set up within the framework of UNESCO's global coalition, which was established in the immediate aftermath of the well-publicized destruction of Palmyra by ISIS. The claimed objective of the coalition was to, and I'm quoting, strengthen the mobilization of governments and all heritage stakeholders in the face of deliberate damage to cultural heritage, particularly in the Middle East. The task force was launched with great fanfare. It was claimed to be an innovative and robust rapid response team who could be deployed at a moment's notice to protect heritage under threat around the world. It was also hailed as the first of its kind, and it was given the moniker the Blue Helmets of Culture, a deliberate reference to the distinctive uniform of UN peacekeepers. At the launch, the then Italian Minister of Defense proclaimed, today, for the first time, we are establishing a service able to intervene within a legal framework wherever our art and culture are threatened. The task force was, and continues to be, primarily composed of officers from Italy's specialist military police force for protecting and investigating art and heritage crime. And the idea was that this unit could be deployed, and I'm quoting again, preventatively, as well as in the context and in the aftermath of a crisis. And special focus was placed on the task force's potential role in combating terrorist heritage destruction, especially at that time in Syria and Iraq. And it's important to emphasize that the task force was clearly not intended to serve solely a decorative or informal function. Indeed, the aim was to vest existing military police specialists with the legitimacy to intervene in conflict situations around the world, enjoying the same powers as those of military peacekeepers deployed by the UN Security Council. And you can see on the next slide the steps that led to the setting up of the task force and the key role that the Italian government played in this process, including a relevant UN Security Council resolution, which legitimated the work of the task force within the broader realm of cultural peacekeeping, which was passed in 2017.
Despite the lofty ambitions of the task force and the significant amount of publicity accompanying it, it seems that the successes of the task force were actually far more modest than might have been expected. In the intervening 7 years since its setting up, the task force was mobilized only 5 times for emergencies or conflicts abroad. One could say that this is a disservice to the massive financial investment that Italy has made in the workings of the task force. Notably, the task force was deployed in 2015 to Iraq, and it has since been revealed to Iraq. And it has since been revealed that the task force's lasting presence in Iraq has been purely military, not training based. It was also deployed to Lebanon following the 2020 explosion, to Mexico, to Croatia, and Albania. Interestingly, though, the task force is really not one of its kind. It's one amongst a cluster of similar related initiatives that Italy itself has been spearheading for the past decade. And one can take a look at this perhaps through this slide. For one, Italy has its own gendarmerie-like unit, which is called the Carabinieri for Culture. This unit was set up in 1969, and it consists of civilian, police, and military components who can take on physical protection roles, also training roles, as they did when they were deployed to Kosovo, to Iraq, and Libya. Italy also contributes to the EU's common security and defense policy missions, which are small-scale to medium-sized military training and advisory missions, whose mandate extends to migration control, counterterrorism, or border management. There are also a whole separate set of initiatives which seem to be on paper purely training-led, training-oriented. Case in point is this International Training Center at Turin on the economics of culture and world heritage. This institute as well was set up to create synergies in the training of experts, both military and civilian. Now, clearly all of these are different, but in many ways also similar, especially in the way that the Carabinieri and Italy's military experts, how it enables these experts to be deployed both at home and abroad for heritage protection. So essentially what the task force did was to create another name for lots of these initiatives which already existed, save for one key detail, which is to link heritage protection to the mandate of the Security Council, as we will later show. This is perhaps why, despite a set of operational guidelines having been promised for the task force way back in 2016, none of these were really developed in the 7 years after its setting up. At the time of its setting up, the only technical detail that was given was that the task force could be deployed upon a request from a UNESCO member state, which perceived that its heritage was in need of rapid protection.
So despite that there have been no operational guidelines developed, and that there's been a kind of general lack of detail about how the task force's mandate differs from all these other related initiatives, it continued to be deployed sporadically over the last 7 years. And the mandate remained precisely as it had when it was drafted in 2016. However, 6 weeks ago, the Italian Minister of Culture issued a decree which was presented in the press release as, and again I'm quoting, activating the task force. Now this was surprising for us because we knew that the task force had in fact been officially active for about 7 years. And we had presented research on the activities of the active task force last year. So it wasn't initially clear to us what, if anything, had changed with the issuing of this decree. So when we investigated the text of the decree, we realized that it enacted one particular change to the task force's mandate. This change was very much not the focus of the press release or media coverage. Indeed, you can see where it is indicated by that red arrow. In fact, it's not even in that paragraph, it's the very last line of that paragraph. So it was hidden kind of, well, we might say hidden in the last line of the press release. Maybe because of this, all the media coverage focused on the more general aims of the task force as they'd been defined 7 years previously, explaining again how the task force cements Italy's position as a point of reference for protecting and safeguarding cultural heritage. Again, I'm quoting, and presenting it as a big step in Italy's supranational mission to protect civilization. The relevant clause from the decree can be seen, I think here, yeah, here, in point 4, which outlines how the task force may now, and this is quite important, I think, which outlines how the task force may now legally be deployed overseas on direct request from UNESCO, dispensing with the need of a direct request from the receiving state. In our view, this is a change which not only impacts the field of cultural heritage protection, but it also represents a radical reform of international law. We argue this seemingly innocuous clarification is in fact the capstone development of a process that has been years in the making. It represents a turning point, a coup of sorts, which bypasses the old order of checks and balances by engineering a change of hands and placing the power to unilaterally decide to deploy military forces, not within the UN Security Council, but within the remit of UNESCO.
To situate this argument, I think it requires us to take a step back and look mainly at how cultural heritage protection as a legal field has evolved. Now, early cultural heritage law was birthed within the domain of humanitarian law. The first evidence of a multilateral, exclusively cultural heritage instrument is this 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. Drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War, the convention proscribed intentional destruction of cultural property, the pillage or plunder of cultural property during times of armed conflict. And the convention exemplified the key markers of cultural heritage law at the time. A, that cultural heritage law was purely for wartime situations, for conflict situations. B, that cultural heritage law was largely state-centric. It was led and engineered, orchestrated by states. And C, that cultural heritage law was actually directed at constraining the actions of occupying forces, much unlike what we see it doing now. Importantly, though, at this time, the UNESCO was only sort of lurking in the background. It was at best a venue for cultural heritage lawmaking. But shortly after the 1954 convention, we see that the UNESCO began pursuing a more active role in cultural heritage lawmaking. And this leads us to the second phase, which is from the 1960s onwards, where we see a change in vocabulary. The wartime regime by that time was quite robust. What we didn't have was any protection for peacetime regulation. So to remedy this, cultural heritage law was actively steered away from wartime to peacetime situations. This move, interestingly and often forgotten, was engineered by newly independent states, such as Korea, Mexico, and Tunisia, as a way to reclaim their heritage, which had been looted by colonial powers. Unsurprisingly, this met with great resistance, also political pushback from powerful Western market states, the same states that were responsible for the plunder of heritage at the first instance. Their resistance ultimately overpowered the decolonial frontier's demands, and we see that the instruments that came out of the UNESCO during this period, the 1972 World Heritage Convention, the 1970 UNESCO Cultural Property Convention, they set up a regime which was seen as largely legally weak, as a sort of toothless relic, because this regime did not capture the main demand of the time, which was criminal protections for heritage destruction. This criticism was also leveled at the UNESCO, which, albeit contributed more materially this time. The UNESCO became a more visible architecture for the conventions. It drafted the conventions, in fact. It demonstrated that the UNESCO is ultimately still powerless in the face of Western state influence.
Dissatisfaction with the limited power of the UNESCO legal regime to protect cultural heritage beyond contexts of armed conflict came to a real boiling point around the turn of the millennium, when with the demolition by the Taliban paramilitary forces in 2001 of the 5th century Buddhist sculptures in the Bamiyan Valley. It provoked international outcry, and UNESCO was widely criticized for not preventing the destruction. There was, I think, a sense of astonishment that UNESCO, the self-appointed guardian of the world's heritage, had just stood idly by. But the reality was that the destruction of the Buddhas did not take place in the context of conflict. In fact, they were undertaken at the request of the then de facto government. So UNESCO was essentially powerless. Within UNESCO, there was an increasing sense that the body's limited lawmaking mandate in these contexts was hindering their image and obstructing the wider goal of protecting the world's cultural heritage. And it's at this point that the main policymakers in UNESCO begin to actively explore how they might begin to give the peacetime regime a little bit more legal teeth, so that it can maybe better respond to acts of destruction beyond context of armed conflict. We can see this, for example, in the way that leading policymakers at the time responded to the destruction. The then General Koichiro Matsuura, the then Director General of UNESCO, stated he would pursue, and I'm quoting, all means available to prevent and punish crimes against cultural properties. In practice, however, UNESCO understood that its limited lawmaking capacity would mean that at this stage, the primary mode through which it would be able to expand, undertake such kind of expansions, would likely be by shaping the rhetoric. And we can see that they were clearly aware of this. In a quote from François Baderin, then director of the World Heritage Center, he described the Bamiyan incident, and he began using this terminology as a crime against culture. And he argued that this quasi-legal term represented, and again I'm quoting, a fresh interpretation of existing conventions. He continued, when new legal avenues are defined, UNESCO will have international law on its side in order to carry out its mission better and to ensure that sites such as Bamiyan everywhere in the world are respected in the future.
Soon after, though, the UNESCO came to realize that a change in rhetorical strategy was far from enough. This realization was brought by the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, which was accompanied by the very publicized looting of the National Museum of Baghdad, when again the UNESCO was criticized for its lack of action. However, this time, the UNESCO is determined to make more concrete legal changes to its mandate. 2003, in many ways, offered an opening for the UNESCO to forge a political partnership with a really powerful political player, which was the US. Much like the UNESCO itself, the Americans were keen to repair the damage that the Baghdad looting had caused to their reputation. Widely condemned for permitting the looting, the Americans set about a campaign to re-script the narrative by painting civilians and individual civilian crime against culture as the focus, shifting focus away from the US's own dereliction at the time. And the UNESCO was only too happy to aid this re-scripting. This was a chance for the UNESCO to get traction for its otherwise weak peacetime regime in the context of the 1970 convention, which we previously spoke about. And it's against this background that the UNESCO and the US jointly launched a plan to author and to back a UN Security Council resolution, which called for an embargo on trade of Iraqi antiquities. In May 2003, as we see in this next slide, the Security Council passed a resolution where it asked all member states to take appropriate steps to facilitate the return of Iraqi cultural property to Iraq. And what this resolution actually did was that it enshrined all the key principles of the 1970 UNESCO Convention without really having to go through the highly technical and long-drawn process of treaty law solutions. Almost overnight then, the UNESCO had managed to do something that it had been struggling to do for years on end, which was to galvanize the 1970 convention. And really the UNESCO bore no bones about the fact that this was what it was doing, right? That this was a direct attempt to change the legal mechanisms available in the convention. In fact, Matsuura also explained, and he publicly noted, that by placing the text of the 1970 convention in a Security Council resolution, what they had achieved was that they were now able to bind all the 191 member states of the United Nations, as opposed to just the 97 state parties to the 1970 UNESCO Convention. This creative legislative avenue was the start, we argue, of a new legal story for the UNESCO, where the UNESCO was able to reposition itself as a troubleshooter, a rapid response expert body. This was the start of a new paradigm where the UNESCO was not just purely advisory or managerial, it had actually arrived as a key political driver of cultural heritage law.
And in 2013, this story of legal manipulation developed further still. Issues of cultural heritage protection were again frontline news. As we referenced before, the widely reported looting and destruction of heritage in Iraq and Syria prompted widespread global outrage. And UNESCO Secretary General at the time, Irina Bokova, deliberately attempted to harness this public interest and began framing UNESCO's work as directly relevant, as a direct response to the more fundamental threat of international terrorism. Through her frequent and impassioned statements on the issue, she aimed to kind of harness this public interest in this situation to advocate for the need for a UN-wide response to the issue of cultural heritage protection. In particular, her deployment of emotive and powerful rhetoric and her invocation of quasi-legal terms such as cultural cleansing have been seen by many scholars as playing an important role in establishing the UNESCO mandate as an issue of security by actively blurring the distinction between the legal regimes of war and peace. By the end of 2013, her efforts have begun to bear fruit by situating UNESCO's mandate as directly relevant to global peace and security level, global peace and security at a rhetorical level, and by deliberately cultivating closer relations between UNESCO and the UN Security Council at a diplomatic level. Bukova successfully spearheaded the passing of numerous Security Council resolutions based around UNESCO policy, effectively opening the door for far more robust and far-reaching legal responses than had previously been on offer. And you can see some of these resolutions here on the slide, and it solidified the idea that threats to cultural heritage should also be seen as threats to collective human security. The Taskforce then caps this trajectory in a drastic way. The 2015 version of the Taskforce saw UNESCO as a sort of coordinator, a liaison point for the UN Security Council. Fast forward to 2022, UNESCO has become massively more powerful, from being the body transmitting instructions to the body calling the shots, almost replacing the Security Council completely. UNESCO now has the power to deploy forces in any situation of crisis it sees fit, without having to seek permission from the UN Security Council or the receiving state. We suggest that this is a significant transformation of UNESCO's role. And we also argue that this highly problematic reframing of UNESCO, all but ignored in mainstream discourse, has been made possible because of a particular reading of what heritage protection is and the central role that expertise plays in this reading. We argue that Italy has both pushed for and benefited from this reframing in a number of ways. And it is this issue that we now turn.
Now, if we look at how cultural heritage law has been working for the past couple of years, we see that it is almost turned into an oligarchy, where you have very distinct epistemic communities which are vested with the epistemic authority to determine what heritage is, what sort of protection that heritage should receive, and for whom heritage must be protected. This reading, we argue, is far from neutral. In fact, the selection of who gets to make these rules is largely often dictated by colonial, neo-colonial, civilizing logics. And these logics are not new at all to cultural heritage law. The trope of the uncivilized non-European world has been cited multiple times to bolster Western stewardship and trusteeship of cultural properties. It's also very deeply embedded in UNESCO instruments. In fact, UNESCO instruments, resolutions contain references to barbaric assaults and violence by the ISIS as a sort of affront to Western civilized peoples. And we argue that one of the rule makers who has actually benefited from this immensely is Italy, which has for long been seen as a cradle of cultural heritage, as an example of a heritage protection model that the world must emulate. In fact, this maps onto Italy's own foreign policy interventions, through which it has been attempting to re-establish itself as a cultural superpower. As former Prime Minister Matteo Renzi himself noted, Italy may not be an economic or a military superpower, but what we are is that we are a cultural superpower. And this is often done using revivalist logics, that we've always been a cultural superpower, and this is the time for us to reclaim that position. And here you can see how Italy does this through a variety of examples of its foreign policy interventions. Italy, for instance, hosted the Ministers of Culture meeting in Milan in 2015, during which 83 countries signed a declaration noting that culture was a tool for dialogue, solidarity, growth, and sustainable development. Italy co-drafted with France the first Security Council resolution dedicated to that issue. Italy organized a G7 meeting in 2017, where it moved from agenda setting to action, drawing on its comparative advantage, having already set up a rather robust Carabinieri for culture. Italy hosts the ICCROM, which is the International Commission for Museums. It holds the presidency of the Council of Europe, the vice presidency of the UNESCO, and it continues to be the largest contributor to the Creative Europe project. And all of these attempts have been quite successful. Italy is today really seen as the only rightful holder of cultural expertise. And the latest development in the task force's mandate is a real exemplification of how this works out in practice. We see in the task force that the experts that Italy appoints have the authority to determine what constitutes a crisis, what constitutes an emergency worthy of intervention. These experts are able to identify which local actors to partner with and how these local actors must be trained. There's also this idea of dependency, almost suggesting that the experts are also the only actors capable of equipping local communities with the necessary skills to contribute to heritage protection. What the task force also does, and we think this is rather controversial and problematic, is that it conflates cultural and military expertise. It doesn't see military expertise of the Carabinieri as something different from cultural expertise. And it uses the overall cultural agenda actually to justify and propagate its broader military policy. And it's clear that this sort of expertization of heritage law is also another derivative of the civilizing logics that we spoke about at the start. In fact, one needn't even call it a derivative because this was very much in the public, in the discourse surrounding the task force, where you see that the task force was hailed by the Ministero della Cultura, the culture ministry, as an important step towards Italy's supranational mission to protect civilization. When speaking of Italy's financial contributions as part of the task force to creative industries in Iraq, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Lebanon, Brigadier General Mariano Mossa also spoke of the gratitude and admiration of local populations that this task force was able to support, offering some sort of safeguard of the cultural vestiges of those lands which were tormented by the civil war.
So I think it's clear that, like its colonial antecedents, the task force is far from a purely philanthropic endeavor. It's clear, in fact, that the cultural heritage here is being instrumentalized by the Italian government to enhance and bolster its political power on the international stage. For instance, in its broader pursuit of UN Security Council membership, by placing heritage protection as the central aim of military interventions abroad, and by presenting cultural heritage work as always a good thing, such interventions become much more difficult to challenge. Indeed, you can see this. There has been almost universal acclaim for these innovative kind of projects that have been launched by Italy. However, it's very clear that from the kind of ethnographic, anthropological, critical heritage evidence, that heritage interventions of the kind promoted by Italy and UNESCO that are built on Eurocentric expertise models often lead to resistance and conflict among local populations. And you can see here, I think on the slide, a picture of a protester, for example, in Kathmandu in Nepal, who is protesting against UNESCO's heritage projects. These projects were actually implemented following the Gorkha earthquake of 2015. And this was a particularly tense protest where anger and distrust of UNESCO's interventions became so extreme that cultural heritage. So this picture basically is showing how anger and distrust of the kind of UNESCO interventions in that context were by no means neutral. People were so upset by some of these interventions that they actually burnt an effigy, and you can see it there, of the head of UNESCO in Nepal at the time, Christian Manhart. They burnt these effigies in the streets, and in fact, it led to quite significant communal unrest in those areas. This was quite a particularly tense situation, but in fact, there's evidence that evaluations of international heritage interventions of the kind promoted by UNESCO, particularly when undertaken by military military units quite often heighten existing political and ethnic disputes among local communities and often lead to a fracturing of existing social networks. The problem is that by glossing over these complex ethnic and political realities of the spaces and the landscapes into which heritage interventions are inserted, by promoting cultural heritage interventions as always good, the problem is that these fail to acknowledge the possibility of the concealed power imbalances that exist within the structures and grammars of these exogenous, expert-led heritage interventions.
These hegemonies are, we think, also quite evident in the legal effects that the task force yields. Now, international law more generally is no stranger to the material dangers of the invocation of peace and security paradigms. Precisely this previously, before the task force's new decree, this was a determination that a threat to breach, threat to peace or a breach of peace existed. That was a determination only the UN Security Council could make. Of course, that model also put a consortium of states, a very select consortium of powerful states, in charge of determining when the world was a threat. And history bears testament to the excesses of that model, whether in Syria or in Libya or even in Rwanda. But when you look at it deeper, you realize part of this has got to do with the states which were vested with power there, but the other part has got to do with the nature of responses to collective threats to security itself. With the new decree of the task force, what happens is that this power, which previously rested with the Security Council, has now been concentrated in the UNESCO and in Italy's experts themselves. When one is reminded of the role that Italy plays in the UNESCO, holding the vice presidency in terms of its really large voluntary contributions to the UNESCO, it becomes clear that perhaps this power is now mostly vested in Italy alone. And that could be highly dangerous. One look at the task force shows that vagueness is completely built into the task force, and that's in the least assuring. The new decree, which dispenses with the requirement of a state invitation, only feeds the overbroadness of legal authority and the fear that there is lack of oversight. The language of the task force, if you look at it closely, also seems to suggest a sort of veneer of human rights application. So like Jessica said, if you look at the UNESCO discourse surrounding the task force, it speaks of how heritage and human life are equivalent. One needn't really choose between heritage or human rights. In some ways, this panders to the strong calls in scholarship and within the UNESCO actually to marry heritage law with human rights. The UNESCO has spearheaded since the 1970s a litter of instruments oriented towards the rights of indigenous peoples, intangible heritage and how it relates with human rights. Regrettably, however, the task force only baits the application of human rights. First of all, it rather paradoxically latches human rights onto an actor which is otherwise known to be a known depredator of human rights because of the nature of their functions, the military. And this reveals the fragility of human rights. More concerningly, by reading heritage protection with a securitization paradigm, it doesn't really vest communities with any rights, communities with any epistemic say or any rights to act as a check against the rights of the states. It effectively places states again at the square and center as the mouthpieces of communities and experts as the key manipulators or directors of state action, and leaves individuals and communities as merely spectators or recipients. This is evident in the fact that the task force omits obligations to take local consent before the deployment of military peacekeepers.
So just to sum up, the aim of our paper is really to attempt to draw attention to some of the more problematic aspects of the recent developments in military heritage initiatives or entanglements, including perhaps most obviously within the task force. The violent legacy of heritage initiatives that the task force follows from reveals a telling tale of how even seemingly technocratic bodies can wittingly or unwittingly perpetrate harm to both heritage and humans to whom it belongs. What we hope to show is that the recent shift towards this securitization When combined with deeply embedded civilizational rhetorics, which center on a form of expertise that privileges those rhetorics, can only work to glorify violent state responses to heritage threats, and often work to disguise political motivations. The shift towards securitization vests state actors and state-supported technocratic bodies like the Taskforce with full authority to enact rapid emergency military responses without needing to consider inputs and challenges from communities, and now without needing to ask for any permission to go in the first place. This makes it all the more important that scholarly interventions employ a reflexive lens in their assessment of this task force, and we hope that this paper will form part of this project. So thank you very much.
I'm a moderator, but if somebody else hasn't raised their hand, I have some. Yes, that was a very. By the way, I thought the dual speaking worked extremely well also. So I want to actually back up to the blue helmets, the actual blue helmets, because the blue helmets aren't really a fearsome military force. So they've been deployed in a variety of different circumstances. So, for example, there are blue helmets deployed on the border in the Sinai between Israel and Egypt, and that's worked pretty well. And this is the sort of situation. So often there's a peace treaty where two countries want to reach an agreement, and they want some sort of fairly neutral referee to stand in between. The blue helmets in the Sinai, if either the Egyptians or the Israelis ever get mad at them, the only thing they can really do is to run away. Right? I mean, they're so tiny in comparison to the forces that surround them. That's true. But because they are respected by both sides, they play a useful and productive role. Now, blue helmets have also been deployed to areas of real conflict. So Bosnia and Rwanda come to mind in this context, and they don't have to. In both cases, they basically had to run and hide. I mean, their choices were to get killed trying to defend somebody, and I don't see how this UNESCO force. So a bunch of Italian Carabinieri, much as I love the Carabinieri, I don't see them being a fearsome military force. And I'm thinking, so there's two countries really in the world, I think, that really are able to carry out overseas interventions and somewhat actively do so, and that's the United States and France. And so I could see a context. So I'm thinking of the original context of the museum in Baghdad. I'm not entirely sure why the United States did what they did. I don't know if they were just stupid and didn't realize anybody would try to loot the museum, or that they were so busy they couldn't think they could afford any soldiers to defend the museum, or maybe some of them were in cahoots with the looters and they were happy to have the museum looted. I mean, any of these things could be true. I don't know what it is. In the middle case, they literally didn't have any soldiers available. I can see how a UNESCO force, okay, fine, we can't spare the soldiers, send some battalions over to guard the museum, right? This could work. And that would be kind of somewhat of the same idea as the blue helmets in the Sinai or one of these other places where they sort of form a border rule, right? I don't know what the issue was in Nepal. I suspect that it was something along the lines of typically these kinds of conflicts, I think, arise because there's some local project, maybe to improve water supply or environment or bring jobs or something like that. And there's some monument that sort of is blocking the development somehow, and local people would really like to have the development, and UNESCO is saying, no, it's going to destroy some monument that we UNESCO think is much more valuable than your clean water, whatever it is. I don't know specifically what it was, I assume it was something of this sort. It's hard for me to see. I mean, the United States and France and other countries aren't going to go invading Nepal with a huge army in order to protect some monument. They could use it as an excuse. I could see next time the United States wants to invade Iraq, they say, oh, somebody's looting a museum, we have to go invade the country. And then maybe they can get a vote from UNESCO rather than from the Security Council. So this seems to me to be like a legitimate flaw in the way this is set up. But I really wonder about this issue of a place like Nepal. I mean, if they were to send some Carabinieri to Nepal, they just get, run out of the town, right? I mean, without the support of the local government, what could they possibly hope? So you sort of project this as if this force is some fearsome force that could really go actively, right? They're going to go into Taliban-held country and fight the Taliban and protect the Buddhas. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous, right? it took all of NATO to do something like that, not a bunch of, not a bunch of Carabinieri. So this is, I just want to get a better picture of what you see as the issue, given the fact that unless it's being used as an excuse, I don't see the prospective military forces having much meaning. Maybe it's like the feathers, maybe for at least like the feathers of peacock tail. They want to pretend to be big so they can get the United, the Security Council. That I could easily believe, but that's not much of a danger to Nepal or. So at any rate, I've rattled on a little too long. Let me see.
Okay. All right. So I'll leave the Nepal point to Jessica. I think she's done fieldwork there, so she has better evidence in response. But on the point about what is the real threat, I think the first level of threat that we foresee is that heritage protection, and therefore the Carabinieri's deployment for heritage protection, becomes a sort of proxy for pure military intervention. Because you are able to subvert the procedure, the checks and balances of the UN Security Council. This is basically another route to pursue military ends, but use the proxy of the goodness of heritage protection to enable it.
So in my analogy, this is the United States wants to invade Iraq again, and they want some excuse, and so they get UNESCO to vote instead of the Security Council. Okay, no, I that's what I was curious about, because indeed that struck me as a.
Yeah, but just the other point in relation to the threat is that. Right. So the other point in relation to the threat, I would say, is that what we have seen so far is really just perhaps 50% of the real incremental effect that militarization of heritage protection could see. And in the media discourse about militarization of heritage protection, even that impact is really downplayed. This happens mainly because of, I think this is something we encountered as well, a lot of entanglements between people you would see as critiques of states and military interventions and the sort of benefits they receive. So you could look at the role that academic universities play in Italy, especially in feeding this sort of narrative. You can look at the role that international press plays. All international organizations are really in cahoots here. And that is why I think even the damage that is caused doesn't invite that much international attention, which to us is quite problematic, because everybody benefits from this sort of entanglement, and that is something that we think will only get worse if it goes unchecked at this stage already.
And I think
I just have a question about that, because it seems to me, so I understand the issue that UNESCO is powerful and is driven by Western institutions, and that it could be very unpopular with people who are being imposed upon by it. But I think that I don't think that the military aspect is particularly important in that. So, I assume in Nepal that they didn't actually send any Carabinieri there to do anything. I don't know that, but I would imagine. No, I think it's the threat of Western sanctions, Western trade, right? It's a threat of other things that Western countries might do. It's sort of, I think the threat of soft power is very real and very prevalent, right? And potentially very dangerous, and maybe adding the military threat to it is, but I feel the ratio between the two is very skewed here towards the soft power. That's what, what was going, I mean, I don't know the details of what happened in Nepal, but if you ask me to guess, I say, well, there was, UNESCO somehow brought the threat of not Western military intervention, but Western soft power if they didn't agree to protect some sort of thing that was very unpopular with Nepalese. Is that, I mean, do you know the details of what happened in Nepal? Could you?
Yeah, so the particular example that we gave there in Nepal, it wasn't, can you hit that okay? It wasn't only the government really that we're talking about there, we're talking about general resistance to UNESCO's presence. So UNESCO have been present in Nepal for a very long time, and they have faced resistance for a very long time. But they don't really modify their programming there because there's a whole lot of money. And what happens is, so yes, this isn't like kind of a resistance to military invasion. I think what we're trying to say with that point is that these initiatives, even though they're presented as always neutral, always good, and that is what allows them to then be this kind of front for whatever else might go along with it, shuts down any kind of critique. But the reality is that when you look at the data, these things are always contested. They're always difficult. They always create complexities on the ground. And so I think it's more like we're trying to connect that political, impactful aspect of heritage interventions, place that next to the fact that these interventions are becoming increasingly militarized, and that militarization is justified by this idea that it's always good, it's always neutral, oh, it doesn't really matter, it's cultural heritage. Actually, it's not just cultural heritage. These things are political. People get jobs with these projects. People really care about what you do with their sacred things. They really care about who gets to do things with their sacred things. So I think it's not necessarily, and I think we probably have to be a bit clear about this in the presentation, it's more like you cannot make these claims that cultural heritage action is always neutral and good because the evidence is that it isn't, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I would make a comment then about the presentation. Again, I think that the militarization part isn't the primary message that you want to communicate. I think it's the non-neutrality part. In terms of the presentation, I would say, in terms of sort of the ratio amount of time you spend on different topics, I would suggest maybe you should spend a little bit more time on the non-neutrality. Tell us some more details about what happened. You know, at least I find these things, if it's concrete, much easier to understand, right? So I have an idea. I mean, it's not like I think you're making things up and I don't understand, but it would be helpful to have examples of the sorts of things. So I mean, for one example, but I don't know if it involves UNESCO, is in the United States and in Canada, there's a big fight over certain burial sites between academics who say this is like long before the current Native Americans, and the Native Americans say, no, this is our burial site, for example, right? So here's a direct conflict between the experts or the archaeologists and the local people who view this as their sacred territory, right? So I don't know if that involves UNESCO, so it might not be directly, but I think it's the same idea. My point is, I think that if you gave several examples like that, it would be effective. So the Nepal was useful that way, but it wasn't very much detail given about what they were arguing over. Right, and I think that no, but I think that those, I mean, I think that those would be very useful. That your answer was basically that, but I think also making it concrete is just super helpful, and also and for us as well, because we're interested in the experts, and we're not seeing. I mean, I am, because I kind of have an idea of what's going on, right? Because I understand this thing in the United States and Canada. I can kind of guess at what's going on in Nepal. Because I've read about some of these different incidents, right? And you know, there's what the anthropologists want, or what the archaeologists want, or what the art historians want, right? May be very different than what the people that live there want, right? And it may involve the way that sacred things are treated, or it may be sort of more mundane. You know, people like to have clean water or something like that. But I think those examples would really, I think that's more what you want to communicate to us, isn't it? I feel that, you know, when you think of all the things that the West does to Nepal in order to get them to comply with you know, why do the Nepalese go along with, why does the Nepalese government allow UNESCO to do this, right? I don't think it's a threat of the Carabinieri, but I think there's a real threat there that causes them to go along with it.
No, I think you're right. And I think for us to know, because I think our instinct is, right, exactly like you say, this is deeply problematic. Is that problematicness not vastly increased and made vastly more dangerous once you have this precedent? Forget even if it's the Carabinieri, when you've created this situation where normal legal checks and balances for the deployment of military forces, and forget that it's the, you know, are dispensed with. Is it possible for us to kind of, does it make sense, I guess, to connect that and to put them together and say, well, look, this is bad. Doesn't it get worse because of this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if I was to think specifically of Nepal, there is, of course, one country that could, there really only one country, well, maybe two, but certainly one country that could intervene militarily in Nepal. India certainly could intervene militarily in Nepal, right? Maybe China as well. So I'm not sure how the mountains work in that respect. But at any rate, but this is relevant because, of course, if India for some reason was, and I know that there's been issues with communist takeover and Chinese influence in Nepal, right? So India might be looking for an excuse to attack Nepal at some point, and UNESCO might be able to provide them with that excuse. So that would be, to me, a possible example of where the danger of the this is really what I was using, but I think this would be relevant specifically to Nepal. I could certainly imagine circumstances where India would be looking for some excuse and would be happy to have UNESCO provide them with an excuse, right? There's a lot of tension between China and India. Nepal is one point of conflict between them.
Just to add to that, I think the militarization aspect of it doesn't necessarily extend to Nepal so much as it does to the other examples we gave, say of Iraq or Kosovo, Libya, Lebanon, as you see in the areas where the task force was deployed. But with Nepal, I think what's important to spotlight there is how expertise sort of removes any chance for critique. And as soon as it removes chance for critique or participation from local population, it becomes like a free pass for anything that you want to call expertise can be called expertise. And that's what we see in Nepal, where this highly technocratic language, highly expertized language that does not sit well with community interests at all, but it works conveniently to silence any sort of community dissatisfaction. And when you place it in the context of the recent developments in the task force, we think that could be highly problematic in the future.
So mostly clarification actually these, but like you, if I understood correctly, you put plenty of emphasis on how democratic the decision making of the UNESCO itself was with the example of Italy, right? Do we have any instances where, for example, let's say an intervention serving Italy more than proportionally as it would in the UN? So does it, like, it almost made me think like democratizing UNESCO itself would prevent this, but is it really different? Is it really served differently because of this power that Italy has differently than the normal balance of power in the UN? Does it matter how democratic UNESCO it is in its own, is my question, I guess.
Yeah, I think it does. Why is because like we were arguing, Italy is actually using its cultural stronghold in the UNESCO to bid for Security Council membership, for instance. Italy is using its stronghold in the UNESCO to center its cultural agenda so much that it distracts attention away from other polarizing policies, say on immigration fronts. It's saying to its UNESCO partners that, hey, look, we are shouldering all the responsibility that all of us have jointly towards heritage protection. And for this reason, you must shoulder the responsibility we have in other departments, say immigration. So the UNESCO's democratization, I think, will help, but the UNESCO is really key towards the sort of limelight, the sort of attention that is paid to Italy's complicity in other departments in the UN more generally.
So I guess we could so it's not that basically they use the interventions directly for their own agenda, but they use the fact that they are so involved in it.
Yes, I think they both create the agenda and exactly. It becomes this thing, they create the rules of the, these various big cultural superpowers like Italy, like France, create the rules of the game. That becomes UNESCO. UNESCO then, of course, it's all inbuilt into the structure of it, if that makes sense. So it's kind of almost a circular situation.
And also one more, this is more clarifying than the other one, but so I think UNESCO heritage sites go beyond than actual sites and stuff, right? Some languages, some rituals.
Intangible. Yeah,
exactly. Yes. So is it part of their even goal of their program to intervene with like a minority suppression or something like that? Or
you mean the task force or UNESCO?
Let's say both.
Sorry. You want to go with this one? Or?
Just to clarify, so you're saying, is intangible heritage currently included in the World Heritage Framework? Yes.
Yeah, would they intervene with a minority being oppressed because of like using the excuse of their language?
But the thing is that the really dangerous aspect of this is that the task force decree contains no regulation of what is a conflict, what is an emergency. So technically, any concern that could at present be of value only to Italy may also just make the cut. At present, it just says, okay, you need to have a crisis, you need to have a conflict or an emergency. The task force can intervene with no temporal check, preventatively during the conflict or after the conflict. But who is to tell what is a conflict? So there might also be an eventuality where the suppression of minority rights, issues over intangible heritage, which may be linked to minority rights, could also come square and center as, could also qualify square and center as a crisis or an emergency that requires the task force to be deployed.
I'm just going to remark that if there's really a conflict, then they're surely not going to intervene. So these marginal conflicts are probably very important that way. I was also going to add that Haile Selassie must be rolling over in his grave, but.
Can you please turn on your microphone? We don't hear you. Can you please turn on your microphone? Mr. Grassi?
Yes. Good afternoon. Well, I have a couple of observations to your presentation. Of course, protecting cultural heritage is problematic like any other activity in life. But there are 2-3 things that I would like to raise also in the light of some of my previous professional experience. First of all, I think that you should take into account that when you discuss protection of cultural heritage, you have to consider that under these points of view, Italy has a rather different history than other Western countries like France or United Kingdom. Insofar, Italy has not been a very significant colonial power, and so has not taken from other countries, except maybe a small period in Ethiopia, where Italy has stolen some elements of the Ethiopian cultural heritage for the Italian museums, but nothing comparable with the activities of France or United Kingdom in countries like Greece or Egypt. So this is why Italy has a different position and the different attitudes towards the question of cultural heritage than other European or Western countries. And this is also historically the reason why the Carabinieri has developed the skill and an expertise in this area that was at the beginning an expertise in recovering treasury and pieces of art that have been illegally exported from Italy to other countries and often also purchased in big society like Christie's or others. That's why, for example, Italy played an important role in trying to have a directive at the level of the European Union for the control on export of art. So this, I think, is an element of the background that should be taken into account when you discuss this kind of issue. The second element is concerned what has been raised by Professor Levine in his comments. I think that there are 2 elements that should be taken into account. One is the question of militarization and one the question of neutrality. Well, it will be, in my view, biased to consider that the protection of cultural heritage only could take place within the framework of a United Nations action where there is a conflict, a civil war or a war between different actors of the international community. Because in reality, the cultural protection is ensured very often by other means, for example, agreement in the field of technical assistance and cooperation to the development. Just to give an example, some years ago, Italy has signed an agreement with Egypt in the field of cultural protection and revamping of some artistic and archaeological sites in Egypt. That's an old tradition. And for example, Italy insisted in order to have not only intervention on Islamic element of the cultural heritage, but also the Christian element. For example, the old Coptic basilic that were in very bad state in Egypt some years ago and now are in the process of being restructured. So this is an element that is not always popular, but is a way to pursue cultural protection without any reference to the situation of military conflict or militarization of intervention. And the other element is the neutrality. Yes, when you intervene in the field of cultural protection, you would like to protect the existence of some culture that sometimes are becoming a culture of minorities in some areas. So if you protect some Islamic elements in Western Europe, you are not neutral. You are doing something that is important for the future, in order to know that the Arab world, the Islamic world, has been important in the history of Europe. On the same vein, if you protect some element of Christian and Jewish presence in countries of Middle East, you protect an element of civilization and of diversity, avoiding that you have a single identity in areas where many cultures have lived together in the past.
I'll take, I think, the first 2 points, and then Raghavi will take the second one. I think it's a really good point. I think we do need to include the fact that Italy has a particular background that is distinct from, let's say, Britain. And I do think that's worth mentioning. I don't think, however, that just because there's a different particular colonial backstory, it necessarily means that none of those attitudes then find their way into the policy. So I think you're right. I think it's really important that we mention that as our research goes forward. And thank you very much for bringing that up. And also, again, yes, as you say, this we didn't have time to address it in this paper, but we are writing about it in another piece about the skills of recovery of looted and trafficked artworks. So again, I think we didn't include it here just because we didn't emphasize it because we maybe didn't think it was as particularly relevant, but yeah, I know it's a point worth making in this context too. And then I think, right, do you want to take the?
Yeah.
So I take it that your point of view on this is that you'd like to distinguish between activities of intervention and activities preventing trafficking.
No, just that we
you don't want to distinguish. What?
Not really.
So you think that even the prevention of trafficking has this politics involved in it?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so maybe you could just give an example to explain that briefly. So I'm not so clear as to why trafficking, what's good about trafficking that we shouldn't intervene with trafficking.
So I am a second year law PhD researcher now, but I used to be an anthropologist, and I did field work on what I don't call looting. I call indigenous curation. And indigenous curation happens all over the world. The flip side of a looting narrative is that there are particular people who are allowed to dig things up. There are particular people who are allowed to make things more beautiful. There are particular people who are allowed to curate beautiful things in particular places. Those people are archaeologists, heritage experts, museum curators. That is quite an extractive way of dealing with ancient objects in many places in the world who would like to keep hold of their stuff. They like digging it up. They like having it in their houses. These things matter to them. So I think even the language that you use when you use looting and trafficking quite often it masks a much more complex set of phenomena that exist all over the world. And it creates a very good guy, bad guy narrative.
There's something here that I don't understand. That's a technical thing. I would have thought that trafficking referred to international trafficking. So you're indicating, so for example, if local people take stuff out of a site and put it in their home, would that under law constitute trafficking?
Okay, sorry, that's looting. But if you're looting and then you're selling it to someone for some money and then they pass it across borders, I also think that's political. I think an Iraqi who finds something in his field and then decides to sell it, immediately then he's part of a looting and trafficking international network. I think that's politically sensitive. I think it's nuanced. I don't think it's good guys, bad guys.
Okay, so the Iraqi that finds something in their field and sells it to somebody who sells it to somebody that takes it out of the country, you think that's probably fine?
I didn't say probably fine.
Okay. No, I'm just trying to get an idea of this, because there seems to be a lot of gradations here.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And when you talk about trafficking, at least what comes to my mind are mostly outsiders that come in and loot sites and stick things on airplanes and take them away. And I'm not so sure why we don't want to prevent that. Whether we be the local people, I don't know that there's a conflict here between
No, I think you're
UNESCO
right.
and local people on something like that. You know, it's often countries are very desperately trying to get back items that were stolen from them long ago. But is it the Elgin Mar? Isn't Greece still trying to get back some stuff that the British stole from them a long time ago? I don't see why, you know, UNESCO's goals and the local goals are necessarily in conflict in a case like that.
No, I don't think they're necessarily in conflict. The problem is that once you create a narrative that says, and we've probably gone a bit off piece here, actually, sorry, where looting and trafficking is always bad. What happens then is that the emphasis is always placed on the source end of that market. If you really want to get people back their stuff, UNESCO could spend a lot of money looking at all the museums that have stuff that's super looted. So it's not necessarily this conflation of like, oh, you know, trafficking is always good. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that this idea that it's always bad is quite dangerous, actually. And especially, as you say, that he's got these very powerful stories about it, right? The bad guy who comes from foreign lands to take it away. Those narratives are they mask a much more complex, much more difficult to untangle set of social phenomena. And I think, you know, if you really want to stop those people's objects being stolen from them, the responses need to be equally nuanced, and they at least need to be aware and transparent about the fact that that complexity exists in those phenomena. I don't know if that answers your question.
I take your point. I mean, the comparison I suppose that I would make, I don't know whether you would agree, would be human trafficking, which is actually fairly small in scale, but it's widely used to impose laws and restrictions that actually have very little to do with the particular problem, right? Or I could also talk about child pornography, which is often used to restrict rights of speech, have nothing whatever to do. So you're arguing, if I understand well, is that these, you know, we have these examples, this is we have for human trafficking or child pornography, these horrible examples, and this is used as an excuse for much smaller scale things that have a much broader impact against things that maybe are perfectly innocuous or quite reasonable. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, I might steal that. Yeah,
huh?
But also that they also mask the complexities that underpin the very problem to begin with, and so it means you can't create the correct solutions if we agree that that is a problem.
Right. So if we could just pick on the really bad things, that would be great, but it doesn't really work that way in practice.
Exactly.
Okay.
Oh, actually, the looting discussion is helpful because it sort of also illustrates Vincent Grassi's point about how there are certain situations where you want to recover certain heritage because it's linked to how your ancestry is defined, or it's linked to older histories of that country's national identity, or even minority identities in that country. And that's perfectly reasonable. I think what the objective of this paper was to show that oftentimes the universal acclaim for practices which might seem philanthropic drowns out the fact that these are also hegemonic structures, that these hegemonic structures, even if they might be fostering nation building, even if they might be history embracing, that they can have really dangerous collateral impacts on communities. They can be purely motivated by political aspirations. And that's a narrative that must be juxtaposed with the goodness of heritage protection. And on militarization, I think in the paper and the task force itself doesn't identify as a purely military body, a purely military oriented entity, in the sense that it's not now an entity that can only be deployed in situations of wartime. Because it uses a language of crisis or emergency, it can very well also be deployed in situations of peacetime, where there are seen to be needs of heritage protection support. And I think that is very much aligned with the UNESCO's broader goals, as we said in the presentation, to move away from an exclusively wartime vocabulary towards a regime that treats wartime and peacetime as equal and is operating in parallel all the time. So perhaps if that was not clear as much in the presentation, we'll try to spotlight the peacetime impact some more.
No, I think what we should do, is thank the speakers for a really lovely and interesting presentation and a nice discussion. Thank you very much.